George is asking, going to the Bowen's reaction series, isn't calcium plagioclase supposed to crystallize right around the crystallization temperature of olivine and pyroxene? And then he goes on to ask, why then does plagioclase come in later according to the LMO model? And also, why are anorthosite crusts rare in other rocky celestial bodies if we expect fractionation to be predominant in magma models?
So first of all, George, that's a very loaded question, but that is a great question.
Recent geology in a nutshell and a newly discovered rock type from the moon. Welcome to the GSOC Geology Hour, our monthly gathering of geology enthusiasts brought to you by the Geological Society of the Oregon Country with support from the Beverly Vogt PSU Scholarship Fund and the Portland State Department of Geology. Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our May 2024 Geology Hour. My name is Alyssa. I'm a current PhD student at Portland State, and this is recent geology in a nutshell. So current research summarized quickly just for you. The more you look at this image, the worse it gets. The magic you can do with Google Slides. So as far as the topics go today, we're going to look at mantle flow and subduction zones, ancient zircon grains in young rocks, the geology beneath Greenland's ice, mud cracks and their connection to climate change, and then potential alkaline paleo lakes on Mars. So this first article here, the kind of theme that goes through the article is how the nature of mantle flow may depend on the type of slab subducting. So talking about subduction zones here. So the full article is called Characterizing the Complexity of Subduction Zone Flow with an Ensemble of Multi-Scale Global Convection Models. So this was published in February of this year in Geochemistry, Geophysics, and Geosystems. And the summary, the kind of the purpose of this study was to use global modeling of mantle convection on Earth to understand the relationship between subducting slab geometry and how the mantle flows around it in response. So essentially, the cliff notes of this is that, yes, the slab geometry, so what is being subducted, is going to affect mantle convection, or just how the mantle moves around in response. So for wide, thick slabs, the main driver for mantle flow in the region is that slab. So that could be this little figure A. I know it's got these white vectors all over it. That's to kind of illustrate the direction in which the mantle is flowing. So this is an example of the Kuril, Japan, Izu, Bonin, Mariana slab. That's so many words, which is A right here on this teeny tiny little map here. So what they also saw is that there can be more complex systems where the flow is affected not just by that one slab, but potentially by surrounding slabs, and also when you have specific types of deformation in play within the mantle or within the slab. And so an example there would be the Sumatra slab, which I forgot to look up, I believe is C right here. So it's not as thick of a slab as the gigantic one that's, half the Pacific there. But the importance of this is that mantle flow in subduction zones can be very complex and variable from location to location. And our quote unquote canonical view of mantle flow in subduction zones that you may see on just like simplified diagrams may merit revisiting kind of in light of this modeling that was done. So our next article is kind of the theme would be searching for Earth's oldest rocks in its youngest deposits. So the article title is Evaluating the Age Distribution of Exposed Crust in the Acosta Gneiss Complex using Detrital Zircons and Pleistocene Eskers. So this was published a few years ago, but I found this to be really fascinating. So it's published in 2022, again, in Geochemistry, Geophysics, and Geosystems. And the purpose of this study then was to map the oldest precisely dated rocks on Earth to understand the early formation of terrestrial crust. So if you're not familiar with the Acosta Gneiss Complex, this is in the Northwest Territories of Canada that has the oldest dated detrital zircons on Earth. So these zircons have been dated at 4.02 gigaannum, so 4.02 billion year old detrital zircons. So essentially what that just means is you have the zircons in that rock may not be, the rock itself might not be datable as old because it was a metamorphosed rock, but those zircons hold on to those early ages. I'm not an expert in zircons, but that's what I know. So of this complex, about 50 square kilometers of the what's anticipated to be about 2,400 square kilometer terrain had been mapped previously. This place is pretty inaccessible. It looks really nice from the pictures, but we have to remember this is in the middle of nowhere. So what the authors of this study did is they used these 20,000-year-old glacial deposits that contained the zircons to estimate the extent of the different terrains. So the Acosta Gneiss terrain, the Wapme orogen, and the Slave Craton, which are all units they know exist in this area. And what they found is that most of the unmapped bedrock in this region is only 3.37 billion year old granitoids. But because they found older zircons in these eskers, they know that there have to be older rocks somewhere nearby, but they haven't mapped them yet. So it's really amazing what you can do with young rocks that have traversed really, really old rocks. So the next article is looking at beneath the ice, Greenland's geology revealed in a new map. So the full article is Geologic Provinces Beneath the Greenland Ice Sheet Constrained by Geophysical Data Synthesis. And this was published in April of this year, again, in geochemistry, geophysics, and geosystems. You're seeing a theme here. And the study purpose here was to use seismic data, gravity data, magnetic and topography data to refine the subglacial geology map of Greenland. I don't know if glacial is a correct word there, but the sub-ice geology map of Greenland. So if you're not familiar, 79% or so of Greenland is covered by ice. And so the rock that's exposed is kind of what they had used previously to say what's underneath. But this study said that what's exposed actually may not represent what's covered. So what they found with this mapping is that the most variable geology is in the northern part of Greenland. But they were able to delineate large portions of Greenland that is not exposed, but there's still 3 regions within that appear to be distinct from the adjacent known provinces and from each other. And these are differences mostly based on gravity and magnetic anomalies. And they said that future work probably should include incorporating even more methods. They used several, as I stated, but adding on more may help refine. And then also others could look at the relationship between these province boundaries. And then, which I think is just the thing we're doing now in science, which is great, is that they say future work could incorporate machine learning to further refine these province boundaries, because these were drawn manually in kind of like our typical way, but using machine learning could potentially remove some of the bias that we as people would have. So this was originally going to be the last one I talked about, but I felt like it was a bummer, so I swapped things around. So essentially, cracking soils could be accelerating climate change. So the full article is called Amplifying Feedback Loop Between Drought, Soil Desiccation, Cracking, and Greenhouse Gas Emissions. And this was published earlier this year in Environmental Research Letters. And the purpose here was to investigate the connection between climate change-fueled drought and carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas release from dried out soils. So here's a picture of some mud cracks there. So it's already known that drought is going to enhance soil cracking, and that those cracking soils, which previously had been holding on to greenhouse gases, as they crack will then release those gases. And what this study had really driven home is that these longer, more pervasive droughts that we're getting with climate change is currently and will continue to increase carbon dioxide and greenhouse gas emissions from soils, which then increases temperature, which causes longer droughts, which causes it's a loop. That's why they had the loop diagram here, and that's why I included it. So what they called this is a self-accelerating feedback loop. And another one of the things that they cited in this article could be happening as well is that when you have these mud cracks, you can also get water percolating into those cracks, which then dissolve carbon mineral stores. And they don't really understand what the full effects of that can mean, but it needs to be studied. And so the authors then urge governmental agencies and policymakers to increase funding for research in this area so they can see what these effects actually are, but also to establish more rigid land use guidelines and promote sustainable land use management. So that was a really fun one. Like I said, I swapped it with the next one. So finally, this article from Elements of last year looks at the high carbonate alkalinity lakes on Mars and their potential role in an origin of life beyond Earth. So this one was pretty interesting. So what they were looking at is just to discuss whether carbonate-rich alkaline paleo lakes may have existed on Mars. And I included this image. This is an artist reconstruction of a paleo lake in Jezero crater. So I'm going to point out where that is. So if this is a map of Mars, Jezero crater's over here. So this study said, yeah, there's over 400 basins on Mars that may have held an ancient lake. And one of the reasons they believe this is the case is that you have these sedimentary deposits in these craters. So most of these basins were formed by impacts, but the study says that these craters then could have held meteoric water. And I want to mention these are paleo lakes. These are expected to have been pretty early as compared to today in Mars's history. So the reason they've been able to make these measurements is largely based on spectral analysis. So they can see, so for the example of Jezero crater, the mineralogy within the crater is consistent with lacustrine or lake deposits. So they've got detrital igneous minerals, phyllosilicates and evaporites, and these spectral data are backed up with rover data as well from the recent missions. And the importance of the carbonate alkalinity is that these highly alkaline lakes could concentrate chemicals that are required for molecular synthesis and the origin of life, such as cyanide and phosphate. And this stuff can be pretty difficult to model because we don't really have anything that looks like this on Earth, so we can't like observe it here personally. But the authors say that because of the weathering of basaltic Martian crust in the CO2-rich atmosphere at the time could have resulted in these carbonate-rich paleo lakes. And it's not understood yet if these could have been favorable conditions for life. But they say, you know, this is something that they need to do more work to better understand this. But it's a pretty fascinating study. And I thought it was pretty easy to read, except it gets real chemistry heavy in there. But I think, yeah, this is a good one to check out. So that's what I've got. And again, I will make the references available, but I will turn things over to Carrie.
All right. I'm going to defer to our speaker of the day and have Daniel introduce himself and take it away. And that way we can learn something new about a new rock.
Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank GSOC for having me. I'm also very thankful for receiving a BevVote grant again for the second time. It's very important for my research. So I'm a third-year PhD student at Portland State University. My research is with Dr. Alexander Ruzicka, and we actually investigate meteorites from space. So that's kind of where I am right now. But fortunately, over Zoom, I can at least talk about my research, which specifically looks at the moon and tries to understand new rock types that come in the form of meteorites from the moon to Earth, or as we like to call them, lunar meteorites. So for this talk, I'm going to be focusing on one specific new lunar rock type that was found in one of our lunar meteorite samples. And hopefully I can at least shed some light on how we think it formed and some future research I plan to do with it. So again, this is newly discovered rock type from the moon. And this rock is called pink spinel anorthosite, or as I'm going to talk about it throughout the talk, PSA for short, sort of an abbreviation. Now, whenever I sort of give talks on lunar meteorites, I always like to set the stage. And I think the best way to do so is to start from the beginning and talk about the moon in general. So the way that we tend to see the moon is sort of how we see it is the moon has a near side, which we can see, and a far side, which you normally don't see. And most of what we've actually understood about the moon came from the Apollo return missions. And so these missions, which are Apollo 11, 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17, these sampled various sites on the lunar near side, and they brought back about 382 kilograms of rock. And so let me show you an example of some of the rock types that they brought back. So from some of these lighter areas you'd see here on the moon, this is called the Feldspathik Highlands terrain. And some of the rocks that they brought back include this sample of what's called a Pharoan anorthosite, or it's a rock that's very rich in plagioclase feldspar, which is a very common mineral we find on Earth, and it's extremely common on the moon. It's actually the most common mineral we find on the moon. From some of the darker parts of the moon, like you see here, these are called the lunar maria, essentially ancient lava flows deposited on the surface of the moon. And from these regions, the Apollo astronauts brought back mare basalts, or just basalts from these areas, like basalts we have on Earth. And from some other areas, like Apollo 17, where they sampled the Taurus littoral valley, they actually brought back some materials that we call troctolites. A troctolite is essentially a rock rich in two minerals, so plagioclase feldspar and olivine, both minerals that we find on Earth as well. And these are supposed to be derived from deep in the crust. So from these different rock types, the scientists on Earth were able to reconstruct sort of how we got from the early moon to the moon that we see today. And here is sort of how the story began. So essentially, back 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth was struck, or at least we think it was, by a Mars-sized impactor known as Theia. And so in the resulting impact collision, you generated this large disk of debris. And that disk of debris coalesced or came together to form the moon. Now, the moon that came together wasn't the same moon that we see today. In fact, most of the time when you're bringing things together and accreting, that energy that's required when you accrete things actually leads to melting of whatever you're accreting. So the moon that actually formed, because it was so hot, it actually melted. And so we ended up with what's called a magma ocean, where most or almost all of it was completely molten, or just essentially magma. And this was actually the most common process that we had in the solar system for what we call differentiation, or the formation of a crust, a mantle, and the core. So for example, Earth, Mars, all of our terrestrial planets, they all underwent this same process. And the moon is no exception. And how we think this magma ocean went from this molten body to the moon we see today, we think we had a process called this. This is called the lunar magma ocean model, or the formation of the moon's core, mantle, and crust. And the way it starts is that you first form the core. So the core forms, and now we're forming the lunar mantle. And so here we actually have minerals that begin to crystallize out of this magma as it's cooling. It's radiating heat off the space, so it's cooling. So we initially form olivine. This is the first mineral to sink. And then the next mineral that forms our mantle is what we call low calcium pyroxene, or just pyroxene. It's another common mineral we find on Earth. And that also sinks out of the magma. And we keep sinking out olivine and pyroxene until we've crystallized about 80% of this magma ocean. At this point, the next mineral that crystallizes in the sequence is now called plagioclase feldspar. And the thing that's interesting to note here is that plagioclase feldspar, once it crystallizes, due to the fact that it is less dense than the melt it's in, it actually floats. And so instead of sinking to form part of our mantle, it actually floats to form a crust, or what we call a global layer of anorthosite, or rocks that are rich in plagioclase feldspar. So that Ferrone anorthosite that I showed earlier, that is a rock type that forms specifically by this process. And so this process goes on, plagioclase keeps crystallizing, and then eventually you're left with just the last dregs, or as we call it, the last remaining liquid in this lunar magma ocean. And it forms two layers. The first is a layer that's called creep, or a layer that's rich in elements rich in potassium, which is what the K stands for, rare earth elements, that's what the REE stands for, and phosphorus, which is what the P stands for. This is a layer that's rich in what we call incompatible elements, which means, as the name suggests, they are not compatible in minerals that form, so they're going to stay in that liquid until the very end. And then the other layer that we form is called the IBC. This is called the ilmenite-bearing cumulate layer. Essentially, this is a layer of very dense iron and titanium-rich oxides. So this is essentially how we think the moon was initially formed by this magma ocean model, but we think that there were some changes afterwards. And so the way I want to word this is that this ilmenite-bearing cumulate layer, which sits right here, is actually more dense than those olivine and pyroxene cumulates that sit below it. And so if the system is still very hot, which the moon still was at the time, and it was undergoing convection, where you were transferring heat from the top to the bottom and vice versa, you underwent something that's called cumulate mantle overturn. And the way I want to word this is more specifically talking about something called a Rayleigh-Taylor instability. And a simple analogy to this is, think about a lava lamp. You have something that's very dense over something that's not so dense. And so you have that material sink, and when it sinks, it actually displaces the material under it, and that rises. And so this is exactly what went on in the moon. You had these ilmenite-bearing cumulates that sank, and when they did, they brought up all these early formed olivine and pyroxene cumulates to the surface. And whenever you bring this up and stuff that formed deep is now at a shallower depth, it actually begins to melt. We call this decompression melting. And this is an important process on Earth for forming basalts, and of course for generating large magma chambers in the crust. But this is a similar process that took place on the moon. And so what we think happened here was that we brought up some early mantle cumulates, they melted, and we formed these giant magma chambers. And in these magma chambers, we crystallize out our troctolites, the one I showed earlier, another rock type called dunites. These are just very rich in olivine. And another rock type that's called a pink spinel troctolite. So these are troctolites, but they have a little bit of spinel in them. Spinel is another accessory mineral we tend to find on Earth. And so we call these rock types part of the lunar high magnesium suite, or MG suite. These are intrusive rocks that intruded into the crust, and these formed after the magma ocean. So now that I go back to here, that's sort of what we've learned from the Apollo samples. And one of the interesting things you might ask is, well, are we actually getting the full picture of how the moon formed? Are we missing any steps in between, or is this everything that happened? And when you look at a map like this, and I think this is a really good sort of visual scenario here, is when you see the moon, you see near side, far side. But how geochemists really like to see the moon, thanks to the fact that we have orbiting spacecraft going around the moon and being able to look for example, elements, we have what's called a map that looks like this. So this is called a global concentration map of a specific element. This is thorium. Thorium is an example of an incompatible element. And you'll notice that the colors are completely different on some parts of the moon than other parts of the moon. And you wouldn't have been able to see this if you just saw the previous image. And these maps are important because these can provide us something that's called geochemical heterogeneity, which means that if we're sampling rocks from the moon, we want to sample everything. We don't want to just sample areas that are rich in specific elements or depleted in specific elements. And so here what you'll notice is that we have this large area right here. This is called the PKT, or Procellarum creep terrain. As the name suggests, it's rich in these creep or incompatible rich elements. That's why thorium is much higher here than it is elsewhere. And our feldspathic highlands terrain that I showed earlier, that sort of makes up most of the moon. And most of the Apollo samples actually came close to the PKT. So the problem there is that we don't have samples really of this feldspathic highlands terrain very much. And so this kind of biases our sampling efforts. And so it's good to obtain samples from different parts of the moon in order to get that full picture. But this isn't the only thing that's going on with the moon. The moon has been struck by many impacts over billions of years. You form craters, you form large impact basins, and as a result, the moon has varying crustal thickness. So this is a map of crustal thickness. Again, this is the near side, this is the far side. And anything that's red tends to have very thick crust. We think this were parts of the moon that maybe this was where the crust was original when it formed. And we think areas with more depleted crust were the result of large impacts that sort of broke away and excavated material. So as you can see, a lot of these craters right here have very thin crust. And what that's going to do is that's going to excavate material from deep and mix it with everything else. So the moon has a regolith. It's just a mix of a bunch of things. So essentially what's going on here is that if we are to understand the moon, we have to first understand that the moon itself is compositionally very distinct, and the moon has seen a large impact history. So there's more to the story than just the Apollo samples we brought back. And you might be asking, what can we use instead to try to understand more about the moon? And I'll get to that in a second, but let me first say that we also have what are called imaging spectrometers. So this is called a moon mineralogy mapper, or the M-cube spectrometer. And back in the 90s, going into the early 2000s, we had a lot of orbiting spacecraft around the moon. So those maps I showed earlier, those were the result of orbiting spacecraft that were able to get density, compositions of the surface. But this one specific spacecraft called Chandrayaan-1 from India had this NASA instrument on it called the M-cube spectrometer. And the whole purpose of this device was it was going to map the entire surface of the moon using near-infrared imaging. So essentially what this does is minerals have at different wavelengths of light other than the visible light, which is what we can see. They essentially can absorb different wavelengths. And you can use detectors like this to detect what wavelengths of light are not picked up on certain parts of the moon to tell us what minerals must be there. And what it found was that on the lunar near side, there were even more complexities than what I showed earlier. In fact, there were some rock types that we found that we haven't even sampled yet. And one of this rock type was found initially in Moskvian's basin, this large impact basin on the near side of the moon, in these stars right here. So very small outcrops, like a couple hundred meters, very small. But it's also been found on the lunar far side and near side as well. So this is Theophilus crater. And you can see it's in the center of this large crater right here. And this rock type, they called pink spinel anorthosite, or PSA for short. And essentially the reason why they called it this was it was rich in this mineral called spinel. Now, spinel, as I mentioned earlier, it's an accessory mineral we tend to find on Earth. So finding a rock that's rich in this mineral is very unusual. It's different from all the rock types that were brought back from the Apollo mission. So it was therefore interesting of study. And as I mentioned earlier with the lunar magma ocean, nowhere in that lunar magma ocean model do you form a rock type that's rich in spinel. Because by that lunar magma ocean model, spinel isn't a phase that you would find. And so therefore, there were a lot of questions that were asked in the lunar geoscience community. More specifically, how do you form this rock type, right? We see it on the far side and near side of the moon, but how does it form? And so there's two main ideas that sort of came together through people who have done lots of experiments. So experimental modeling has shown that, okay, if we took a troctolite and we put it on the moon, we know that the moon has seen a large impact history, a lot of craters on the moon. So what if we make a large crater where there's an area that there are troctolites on the surface and we melt the entire thing? And so if we melt, essentially what we form a troctolitic melt. So essentially we know troctolites are made up again of olivine and plagioclase. If we took magnesium from the olivine, we took aluminum from the plagioclase, we can form a lot of spinel from this melt. So that's sort of the first idea, but that requires there to be lots of impacts. But we know there are lots of impacts on the moon, so it's a plausible idea. The second idea says, okay, we know that on the moon, we have large igneous intrusions, the same ones that form the lunar MG sweep. Well, what if, for example, we had some of these intrusions go into the crust and we actually were able to melt a large amount of that crust? So this melting process is called assimilation. And essentially, the idea is that if you have this magnesium-rich melt that intrudes into a plagioclase feldspar-rich crust, which is very rich in aluminum, you can take magnesium from the melt, you can take aluminum from the crust, and you can form spinel that way. So essentially what we have here are two types of ideas. You either form spinel by a large impacts on the moon, or you form spinel by interactions between magma inside the moon and crust. And this is really important on a large scale. And the reason why it's important is because this tells us that on the moon, we're forming rock types by secondary processes. So either we can form brand new rocks by impacts, or we can form brand new rocks by assimilation, which is very common on Earth, and it's an important process for forming new rock types. So if we can find out how this rock type was formed, this can tell us that some important process on the moon took place that we haven't been accounting for when we're trying to understand how the moon evolved. Now, of course, if we can't sample it in the Apollo samples, because like I mentioned earlier, we haven't sampled a rock rich in spinel yet, what's another way we can sample this rock type? And that's where lunar meteorites come in. So lunar meteorites, by the name suggests, they're rocks that, of course, have to be ejected by impacts on the moon. So you have to have craters, you have to excavate material. That material has to enter an Earth-crossing orbit. Fortunately for us, we're the moon's closest neighbor, so we sample a lot of the material that gets blasted off of there. And now let me just mention that meteorites themselves are really cool in one way, is that, especially from the moon, is that we know that the moon has lots of craters. So essentially, these meteorites can come from anywhere. So while the Apollo samples are restricted to this region of the near side, you can have lunar meteorites come from the far side, places we haven't sampled yet, specifically from this feldspathic highlands terrain. So they're more representative of sampling different parts of the moon. But probably the most important thing is that if I show an example of this lunar meteorite right here, this is called a feldspathic breccia. It's a rock rich in feldspar. So all these clasts right here are rich in plagioclase feldspar that makes up this crust. And some parts of these clasts could come from this region of the highlands on the far side, and some parts of these clasts could actually come from the near side. So in this small sample, we can sample parts from the far side and near side of the moon all in one. And that's incredible because instead of having to go to both areas and pick up samples, we can look at all that in one sample. The only thing I have to say when you're looking at lunar meteorites that you have to be careful of is, again, the fact that they were struck by impacts in order to get excavated from the moon. And whenever you have impacts on the moon, you're creating, it's a large energetic process, right? You have a collision, you generate a lot of energy, and how is that energy accommodated? In the form of shock waves. And whenever you have shock waves that quickly move fast through solid material, they're going to deform the material, leading to increases in temperature and pressure, and create what we call secondary shock effects. This is called shock metamorphism. And it's different on Earth because on Earth we sort of have, we have metamorphism take place like regional metamorphism, you have contact metamorphism. This is metamorphism that's solely generated by shock waves that deform solid material. So here's an example of a complex crater we see on the moon, and you can see all this material in this crater has been affected by this impact and affected by the shock waves passing through, and so they've been shock metamorphosed. And so here's an example of a figure. This is a cross-section of essentially a crater. And what I want you to pay attention to is pay attention to these areas labeled A, B, and C. So A is closest to the center of where the impact took place. And you'll notice that I have what are called shock pressures. These are measured in gigapascals. The way I want you to interpret this is sort of a relative scale. So the closer you are to the center of the crater, the more effect you're going to feel from the shock waves. So the more energy is going to be dispersed there. And so the higher the shock pressures. And so rocks that are so parts of material on the surface of the moon that are closest to where the crater center is are going to experience whole rock melting. They're going to be completely vaporized. Some of them might completely vaporize into a gas. Or you'll just end up with a lot of melt on the surface. As you begin to go away, temperatures are lower, so you're not going to melt the material, but you're going to undergo what's called solid state deformation. Solid state deformation or plastic deformation, the way you want to view it is if you had a piece of copper wire and you sort of bent it, you'll notice how when you bend it, it doesn't go back to its original shape. That's called plastic deformation. And that takes place in these solid materials from the moon as a result of this impact. And as you go further away from them, you get what's called mechanical deformation or fracturing. So if you just break a piece of chalk, that's an example of fracturing. These rocks in these areas are essentially just broken up or disrupted by the shock wave. So impacts can do a large damage to lunar materials that were initially on the surface. And if you imagine you have 4.5 billion years of impacts and many craters, you're going to essentially damage a large amount of materials on the moon. So my research is to understand the origin of materials on the moon, but I also have to take into consideration the fact that they've been heavily shocked on the moon as well. So for my research, I studied the chemical crystallographic properties. So I use a technique, and I'm trying to investigate different types of rock. For this talk, I'm going to be focusing on pink spinel anorthosite clasts that I found in one of my lunar meteorites. This is lunar meteorite, Northwest Africa, or NWA for short, 15500. And so this will be the focus of my talk. So let me first begin by showing how I actually found these pink spinel anorthosite clasts for the first time. And so here's sort of an image of the meteorite that was sent to me. So a collector actually cut this meteorite and he sent it to me. He wanted it to get classified. He wanted to know, is it a rock from the moon? And when I saw this picture, I saw these sort of red things right here. And I said, these look really unusual. I've never really seen these in a lunar sample before. And so these are some close-ups, and you notice that they're very red, almost pink in color. And so I said, okay, I will classify the sample for you. So he sent me a piece of the sample, and I received three pieces, one that didn't have those red clasts and two that had large red clasts. So I made thin sections of these. So a thin section is essentially a polished, very thinly sliced sample of a rock, about 30 microns thick. And we use this in sort of optical petrography to sort of try to understand what minerals might be there. It's a very useful technique. And so what I found was when I look at this rock, I see this sort of rock type in here. This is a clast, and it's sort of different from everything else around that. Same thing here. And I realized that these clasts look very rich in spinel. So spinel has a very distinct properties when you're looking at it using the petrographic microscope. And I said, these might be related to that pink spinel anorthosite. So I jumped on the opportunity to get these on the scanning electron microscope and collect as much data as I can. Now, the scanning electron microscope is a very interesting instrument. We use it at Portland State for a lot of different purposes. And the way it works is pretty much we put our sample right here, and we have a lot of detectors aimed at our sample trying to collect different things. So the way it works is you have this, essentially this column right here, and you have this electron source. You produce electrons, and they focus down on your sample. And when they interact with your sample, you can have many different reactions of those electrons with atoms in your sample. And you can create X-rays, you can create other electrons. And I'm mainly focused on a few of these interactions because I can generate specific things that I can use for my research. So the first thing I try to use are what are called backscattered electron images. These are just images generated by electrons that interact with their sample, and they're sort of scattered back, if you want to view it that way. So they interact with atoms in our sample, and then they're just scattered back. And these can provide information on what sort of minerals I'm looking at in my sample, what sort of elements I'm looking at in my sample. View it sort of like as a density contrast map, if that makes sense. Almost like an X-ray or like a CT scan photo in a way, but for rocks. The second interaction you can get are X-rays. You can have electrons that hit our atoms in our sample, and they can generate X-rays. And these X-rays serve as the fingerprint for understanding the chemical makeup of whatever I'm looking at in my sample. So these are important if I'm to understand what my minerals are in my sample. And finally, I also want to understand the crystallographic makeup of my sample. So I have what's called an EBSD detector that picks up diffracted electrons, and these can produce patterns that can tell me about the crystallographic or 3D mineral structure of my sample. So this is very useful because it can tell me essentially what mineral I'm looking at and how it's oriented on a 3D crystallographic basis, which is something I can't normally get because I'm looking at a 2D slice of the sample. So all of these techniques are very useful. And one last thing I do want to mention about EBSD is this can also tell me about deformation in my sample, because heavily deformed samples are going to behave a little bit differently than samples that aren't deformed. So I can use this to investigate shock metamorphism on the moon as well. So let me first talk a bit about what you're seeing here. So these are two of those pieces that I showed earlier, and these are my pink spinel anorthosite clasts. These maps are called essentially false color chemical images. So you're seeing a bunch of colors on the screen, and every color is mapped to a certain element. So that basically tells me where my elements are. These are basically X-ray maps. And the combinations of these elements give me distinctive colors. So what I've done here is I've circled these PSA clasts and I've actually colored them in a different scale right here. So you'll see this is called an RGB map below these three clasts here. Magnesium is red, calcium is green, and aluminum is blue. And right here, this is a color code map of what the mineral phases would look like according to their color. So anything purple is my spinel. You'll see there's a lot of purple. So of course, these are rocks rich in spinel. Anything green is my plagioclase feldspar. There's a lot of plagioclase feldspar. And anything red is olivine. And there's just very little amounts of olivine. So based on this, the fact that I know that, okay, this is a rock rich in spinel and plagioclase and very little olivine, I knew right away that this fits the observations that were initially found by that M-cubed spectrometer, all that orbiting spacecraft detection. Those criteria that they found when they were looking on the moon is what my class fits. So I knew right away, okay, the textural results fit pink spinel north-side on the moon. But now what about the chemistry? Because this is something that we couldn't get with those spacecraft, but we could get it with these clasts. And so this is just, again, this is just a close-up of some of these clasts. The thing I just want to note right here is that we have spinel and we have olivine and we have plagioclase feldspar. That's what this is right here. Now, some of the plagioclase feldspar you'll notice is smooth. This is sort of a smooth texture right here. And here it's sort of kind of fractured. So this smooth texture essentially is a new phase. This is called maskelinite. And it actually forms from plagioclase feldspar as a result of the shock waves. So right away, I noticed in these clasts, they're heavily deformed. I've got a bunch of fractures everywhere, and I'm forming new mineral phases. So I knew these clasts were deformed. And so I wanted to understand how they were deformed, but I also wanted to understand how they formed. So I basically looked at the mineral phases, and I used the X-ray detector to find out what their chemistry was. So this is sort of so let me break down this figure really quick. So what you're seeing on the X-axis is the chromium number of spinel. What this means is I'm looking at two elements. I'm looking at how much chromium is in the spinel versus how much chromium and aluminum is in the spinel. So I'm basically looking at the ratio of how much of a certain element I have in my mineral. And I'm comparing that with what's called the AN number of plagioclase feldspar. This is just seeing how much calcium I have in my feldspar, because feldspars can be calcic, they can be sodic, they can have potassium. I'm just trying to see what my chemistry is of the mineral phases. And lastly, I'm comparing it with the Mg number. This is how much magnesium I have in my sample over how much magnesium and iron I have in my sample. And I'm comparing it with a variety of different rock types. So the PSA clasts are going to be these purple circles right here. And then you'll notice that I have these reds and these blues. These are pink spinel troctolites, which are these samples right here. These are Mg suite samples, as are these troctolites and these dunites. And I'm trying to see, are these related to these Mg suite samples? Because I noticed from the texture, these are very coarse-grained rocks. And so I'm comparing their chemistry with these rocks' chemistry. And I can see there's actually quite a significant overlap on all three of these regions with these red dots or these pink spinel troctolites. So what it's showing is that the chemistry of the minerals in my PSA clasts are very similar to those in these pink spinel troctolites, and they have similar textures. So when I saw this, I said, okay, there has to be some relationship right away between pink spinel northicites and the lunar high magnesium suite. So therefore, my conclusion here was that our PSA clasts likely formed by a similar process that formed these pink spinel troctolite clasts. I call this process magma wall rock processes between initially a northacitic crust and Mg suite parental melts. And so what does that mean? Well, what that means is that if I again show this model for how we think pink spinel northicite might have formed on the inside of the moon, we think that we had these early formed magnesium suite melts that rose by partial melting of mantle cumulates. We think they entered the crust and they were extremely hot. And we think they were able to melt or assimilate a large amount of this plagioclase-rich crust. And at the margins, or what we call the wall rock areas between these two boundaries, is where we can form this pink spinel northicite. So this is really cool because this tells us that we had magmas on the moon that were hot enough to melt crust and form new rock types by assimilation. So this process didn't just take place on the Earth, it also took place on the moon. But that's not the end of my research. I have to understand, again, what exactly happened in these magma chambers, because Magma chambers are a lot more complicated than how we used to think back in the days. We used to initially think that if you had a simulation, you just took crust or whatever you were assimilating, and you took the magma and you mixed it. But it's a lot more complicated than that. So here's sort of an example of what really is going on in the magma chamber. So here's your magma, here's your wall rock. You're transferring energy to the wall rock because you're melting it, and you're incorporating mass. So the wall rock is being melted into your magma. But sometimes you're bringing on material from the wall rock that wasn't melted. This is called stopping or stoping, however you pronounce it. Sometimes you are assimilating wall rock, so it completely melts. And while this is going on, you're also crystallizing minerals in this magma chamber. So if you've ever heard the term AFC, or assimilation fractional crystallization, this is kind of what they're referring to. You're assimilating material, but you're also crystallizing material on the bottom or sometimes along the walls of these magma chambers. And you're having magma recharge. So you're having magma come up from deep and replenishing this magma chamber. So it's a very complex process that goes on. And what I was trying to understand here, part of my research is, okay, I know that pink spin-on-orthosite had to have formed in these chambers, and I know there was some assimilation, but was I getting complete assimilation? Was I getting mixing of material, but not complete assimilation? Was I getting some stoping? Was I getting partial melting of the wall rock? Was there recharge? Was there fractional crystallization? What exactly is going on here? And what else can I use to try to understand this? And so to get back at this, I thought that maybe I can use electron backscatter diffraction data to evaluate not just the shock deformation history, but maybe I can get a sense of understanding what was my crystallization sequence of the mineral. So what mineral formed first, then what mineral came later, and maybe I can use that to discern what really is going on in this magma chamber. And so for the remainder of my talk, I'm just going to show some preliminary data that I've collected on one of my clasts. There's still a lot more data that I'd like to collect, but I'd like to just share. So this was one class. This is PSA class number 5. So whenever we do electron backscatter diffraction, we can get multiple images. This is called a phase map. And so it basically just says, okay, if I see a certain mineral phase, I'm going to give it color. So anything pink is spinel, anything purple is feldspar, anything green is olivine. And now the next map that's interesting that EBST can get, because like I said earlier, it can get the crystallographic orientation of these minerals in 3D, is called an inverse pole figure map. The way you want to view this is sort of a map that can tell you crystallographic information on how my minerals are oriented. And the way this is important is that when minerals are crystallizing out of a magma, sometimes they can form at random orientations, and sometimes they can form at a specific orientation. This can be controlled by, this can give me control on what the mineral sequence was during crystallization. So what I want you to sort of view this map as is, if you see colors that are different, that means the mineral crystallized at random orientations. If you see the same color, that means they crystallized at the same orientation. And finally, the last map I'd like you to focus on is a map that's called grain orientation spread. This is specifically to understand the effects of shock deformation on the mineral. So how were my minerals deformed by shock waves? And the way I want you to view this map is the relative amount of deformation by shock. So anything that's greens, yellows, reds, these are areas of the class that have been heavily shocked, more so relative to areas that are blue, which have been less shocked. So I'm going to just briefly show my results for different minerals, and then I will give some conclusions. So first, we're looking at just spinel. So that's just the pink right here. And if you look at this inverse pole figure map, you'll see it's completely random. There's no specific color that dominates. You'll see a lot of blues, greens, reds. What that tells me is that spinel crystallized from a melt in a random orientation. And if I look at the grain orientation spread, we can see that spinels are blues, they can get greens, there's a little bit of yellow here. So these spinels have been heterogeneously deformed. So this one class, all these spinels have been shocked differently. They've been deformed differently by the passing shock wave. It gets interesting now when I look at plagioclase feldspar, that's this purple right here. We can see a predominance of two colors. We can see sort of this red to pink, and we can see this orange to yellow color. What this means is that plagioclase feldspar has a preferred crystalline orientation, which means when it crystallizes out of that melt, it crystallizes in a very specific way. And that has implications for how it formed. And finally, if we look at grain orientation spread, we can see plagioclase feldspar has a lot of blue and very little green, which means it's been not as deformed as the spinel. So it's seen very little shock deformation. And finally, when we look at olivine, olivine is mostly found along the rims of these clasts. So it's sort of on the edge. We can see in this inverse pole figure, it's got this green color here, and then it sort of has this red, yellow color, and maybe there's a little blue here. But it seems to be also at two preferred orientations. It's at two specific colors. So this also tells me that olivine had to crystallize out of the melt at a preferred orientation. And finally, when we look at the grain orientation spread, we can see that the olivine is very green. And what that means is that it's seen a lot of deformation relative to spinel and plagioclase feldspar. And so what are my conclusions here? Well, so above, these are my previous conclusions that I found that PSA and pink spinel troctolites are similar. So we think that these PSA clasts formed by magma wall rock processes on the moon in these large magma chambers. But now let me just briefly talk about the EBSD results. I said that spinels displayed random orientations. What this means is that these were what we call the liquidus phase. So these were the first minerals to crystallize out of that melt. So we think we had the magma, then we formed spinel. But when we look at plagioclase and olivine, we can see they have those preferred orientations, like I said. These are what we refer to as oikocrysts, which means we think they crystallized after spinel. So we think that we formed a lot of spinel and that the next minerals to crystallize sort of grew or nucleated off of that spinel in a specific configuration, leading to preferred orientations. So we think our crystallization sequence went spinel, then plagioclase, and then olivine last. And finally, the variations in the grain orientation spread that I've showed within the different minerals tell us that this was all due to shock deformation. And we think what this means is the fact that they're different. We think that there might have been multiple shock events that might have deformed each of these minerals in a varying way. Or within the same mineral, we think that two different shock events might have taken place. Some that have deformed parts of the class more, and some that have deformed parts of the class less. So I'm currently doing work in progress to understand this and understand sort of everything related to where in the magma chamber these classes are formed. And it is a very complicated sort of project, but I've really enjoyed this project, and I'm very thankful for all of my funding sources. And hopefully I didn't go over time too much, but I'm happy to take any questions. So thank you again.
Oh, Daniel, that was absolutely fantastic. And I know it's super complex, and you brought it to a level that most of us could probably understand fairly well. Yes, you did have some questions. So going back to slide 19, and that was the one that showed the meteorite shock sequence, is what are the approximate depths of effect for A, B, and C for the largest meteorite impacts? And a side question, is this also the same diagram we would be seeing for meteorite impacts on the Earth?
That's a great question. So the way this scale, so the way this is sort of formatted, there's no exact sort of distance scale on here. But the way I would want you to interpret that is whenever you have a shock wave that propagates from a source where the impact took place, the shock wave moves three-dimensionally. So it doesn't just move left and right, it moves down into this material. And so the closer you are to that central point, the higher the pressure you're going to be. So if you're thinking about depth, what that means is that if you're just beneath the surface where the impact takes place in, you're going to be at that high shock pressures and you're going to have melting. But if you're further down, at depth, you're going to see maybe some plastic deformation. And then if you keep going, you're going to get mechanical deformation or fracture. So this same impact crater sort of sequence is universal. This you'd expect sort of anywhere, as long as you can generate a large energetic collision. You will expect to find melting and then plastic deformation and then fracturing the further away you go from the source. And yes, you do see this also on Earth, and you do see this on other planetary bodies as well.
All right. George is asking, going to the Bowen's reaction series, isn't calcium plagioclase supposed to crystallize right around the crystallization temperature of olivine and pyroxene? And then he goes on to ask, why then does plagioclase come in later according to the LMO model? And also, why are anorthosite crusts rare in other rocky celestial bodies if we expect fractionation to be predominant in magma models?
So first of all, George, that's a very loaded question, but that is a great question. And let me first start off by trying to answer your first part here. So really, the way you want to view this is Bowen's crystallization sequence sort of is almost is sort of like in a vacuum. You'd expect that at a given equilibrium condition, you'd expect different minerals to form at different times. But the moon or any large magma ocean is a very complex sequence where you have this initial starting composition of a melt. And from this starting composition, you can predict what minerals would form if you run experimental work on the melt or even computer simulations. And they would say, okay, this mineral would be expected to form first at this temperature. And then if you keep cooling, you'd expect this mineral. But it's highly dependent on whether or not your minerals are in equilibrium with the melt they're in. Because if they sink and you get fractional crystallization, that changes your remaining composition of the melt. And so you might crystallize a different mineral at the expense of another one if you had initial equilibrium crystallization. So the way on the moon that we found is that all of the crystallization models that have run through experiments, so people have done work in a lab trying to replicate the sequence, or through computer modeling, it's been found that olivine is the liquidus phase in this model from this starting boat composition, and then pyroxene becomes the next stable phase, not plagioclase feldspar. And then plagioclase feldspar in some models what really controls when plagioclase feldspar crystallizes in this sequence is the bulk aluminum content of the melt. Because if you don't have enough aluminum in the system to begin with, you can't saturate plagioclase feldspar early on in the sequence. So by crystallizing olivine and pyroxene, you're raising the bulk aluminum content of the remaining system because aluminum is, of course, relatively incompatible in these two minerals. It's going to be in the melt. And then when you saturate plagioclase feldspar, now you can put out your aluminum into a mineral phase. Now it becomes compatible. If you start off with a composition that has a ton of aluminum, you're actually going to form an earlier onset of plagioclase feldspar and a much thicker crust. But if you remember that I showed later in those models of that topography or crustal thickness on the moon, according to the crustal thickness of the moon, which we think is anywhere between, on average, about 34 kilometers thick, what that means is that calls for magma ocean models that have formed the plagioclase feldspar late. Because if it formed early, it would have actually ended up with a much thicker crust than what we see on the moon. So that's actually a large debate going on about the thickness of the crust and when we form plagioclase feldspar. The second part of your question, why we form a crust of plagioclase feldspar, there's two ways of thinking. The first is that on very small bodies, so bodies like the moon, bodies like, for example, Vesta, which is the second largest asteroid we have in our solar system, relative to the terrestrial planets, because they're so small, the way that convection behaves in these bodies during their magma ocean stages are slightly different than on the terrestrial planets. So people think that when you don't have as much rigorous convection and you have more of this settling, you can potentially generate more feldspar and you can maybe form a global lid of feldspar. But the other idea here is, again, it goes back to bulk composition. So if you have a melt that is depleted in elements like sodium, potassium, volatile elements, because of the fact that when you formed the moon, it was molten. So we think that a lot of these volatile elements were lost to space. You're going to end up with a feldspar that's very rich in calcium and aluminum. And because of that, it's going to crystallize earlier on in the sequence than sodium-rich feldspar because it's got a higher melting point. And so we think that if you form so much of it, you would actually form a lid of the feldspar. And the final thing, there's so many factors that go into this. The final thing is what's called feldspar retainability, which means how well does the feldspar float in the melt it's in. You need a large density difference between the feldspar and the melt. Otherwise, it's not going to float to form that crust. If the densities are the same, it's going to stagnate or pool, and you're not going to form this anorthosite crust. So we think there's a large sort of convection, bulk composition of the melt, when you form feldspar, the density difference, all of this makes the moon a very unique body because the moon has a feldspathic rich crust, but Vesta has a large amount of basalt. And then of course on, Mars, Earth, we think we had a large amount of basalt too, and not this anorthosite. So a lot of things have to go right to form this anorthosite crust. And the moon is a good example of that.
All right.
I hope that answers your question.
And you guys are probably close enough that he can come down the hall and knock on your door and ask that question, if I
Absolutely.
understand where George resides. So we had another question, kind of slipping over to your PhD. So after you have completed your PhD, what are the best scenarios for continuing your research? Are there educational and governmental institutions doing cutting-edge research on lunar geology?
That's a great question. So for me, one of the things I'm very interested in, besides doing lunar research, is also meteorite classification. It's sort of something where, like I mentioned, this sample I received from a meteorite dealer or collector, and so I receive samples from people all the time about suspect meteorites. And so for me, what I'm very interested in is combining my research on lunar meteorites, but also trying to work in a facility that receives a lot of samples from either collectors or receives samples from government agencies like the Antarctic Meteorite Exploration Program, where people go to Antarctica for 6 weeks and they camp out there and they collect rocks and they bring back meteorites. So I think for me, something I'm very interested in is either working with the Smithsonian Institution, who handles this large collection of meteorites from Antarctica, or potentially Johnson Space Center, if they're ever accepting applicants at NASA, to work on Artemis return missions, because we are going back to the moon, hopefully next year, if not the year after that. And when we bring back samples, I would like to be someone who works on those and sort of characterizes each little piece and sort of does that. So I don't know, my pathway is kind of open, but hopefully some avenue opens up where I can do a bit of classification and research together.
Sounds like there's some opportunities. So
Well,
lots of
I wanted to,
comments.
can I ask another question on that?
Go ahead.
Yeah, because I was wondering if you had any plans to teach, because I could listen to you talk about this forever. You're so good at talking about this. And even if it's not like in a classroom setting, I was wondering if you had kind of that in your mind, just as general science communication.
So it's kind of always been in my mind. So the thing with academia that I find interesting is that there's sort of like many different pathways you can take. And so definitely being a professor, of course, is like one of the most important ones. And I mean, if the possibility is there, I'm definitely open to teaching and doing my research at the same time. So yeah, it's always there. Yeah. Thank you, by the way, for the comment.
And that's where I was going with my next comment, is there's been a lot of very positive comments and compliments about how you put your presentation together, because with transitioning between the different phases and showing those same three mineral groupings and how they were affected was basically very effective. So kudos.
Thank
That
you.
was
Thank you.
wonderful. Going down through here, I think most of these are, I don't see any additional. So there was one question about how about shock deformation comparing impact on solid or the old moon versus impact on a molten moon?
Mm.
Because it was probably, the moon was probably getting pounded all along.
Mhm. That's a great question. So essentially, there's a few ways you can think about this. So obviously, when I'm thinking of a molten moon, or at least when I'm thinking of that when I'm starting to form my crust, I'm thinking that maybe it's a lot more hot than it was today, right? So it's still at a higher temperature. And so when you get impacts, right, on something that's at a higher temperature, you're more likely to undergo plastic deformation if you were just assuming temperature alone. But also, another thing to consider is that if something stays hot for long periods of time, minerals can actually recover from earlier shock events because they're still hot. The atoms in their crystal structure can actually sort of rearrange themselves back to sort of an undeformed state. And so you can actually reverse a large amount of that shock damage that you did early on, assuming the material stays hot for extended periods of time. So I would imagine that if the moon has a large history of many collisions, the earliest crust that you form, maybe some of your impacts into that, whatever shock deformation you might have put in probably isn't preserved. But I would expect areas of the moon that have, once it's cooled over time, which depends on who you ask. Some people think that the moon cooled within 10 million years. Some people think the moon had to have cooled within 300 to 400 million years. that those areas that are relatively cooler, if you had a large enough impact, you can probably have enough sort of shock damage there where you're losing more heat to space than you are keeping the material warm enough to remove the shock deformation effects, unless you're deep in the crust. That then is when you'd start to see the effects of shock deformation being preserved over time.
Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you, Daniel. And if Paul's okay, I do have one last question I would like to ask. How do you know that it's a lunar meteorite? Is it geochemistry? Because I know we're getting impacted by meteorites from all over. So how do we know that it's actually from the moon that you're getting these samples? Is it the chemistry of the puppy?
Yeah, so the funny thing about lunar samples and even probably meteorites from Mars is that there's been so much work done on them that we can simply get a rock, and in a thin section, put it under a scanning electron microscope, and within probably 10, 15 minutes, we can tell you with almost certainty that it's from the moon, it's from Mars, it's from here. Meteorite classification has evolved where we have so many samples we can really pinpoint where most of our meteorites are from just by mineral chemistry. And it's a really cool thing. And it's one of the ways that honestly, the hardest part really for me is when someone sends me a rock from the Earth, we call them terrestrial rocks. And when they ask me if it's not a meteorite, what is it? I really have trouble telling them what it is because I don't study Earth geology that much. So I'm like, okay, I know it's from Earth, but like, I can't tell you if it's a sandstone, like this kind of a sandstone or this kind of a sandstone. I can just tell you it's not a meteorite. So it's kind of funny. Meteorites are almost easier for us to identify than Earth rocks.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so on the flip side, as a geologist who had a lot of people come walking in the office with, I have a meteorite, is I would take a look at it and I, on the flip side, could go, it's a lovely piece of basalt that you have here. And if it was questionable, then I would send them over to Portland State to talk to the meteorite folks. Like, okay, you need to go talk to these folks. So yeah, I can appreciate that. That's pretty cool. Well, thank you so much. This was just an absolutely excellent program between Alyssa and Daniel and learning about soils and cracks and all sorts of Greenland and then a new rock on the moon. Pretty darn cool. So thank you very much.